Hello, welcome back. We have the honor to host our opening keynote address. We want to welcome Dr. Kirsten Pai BUICK. Dr. BUICK is a longtime supporter of Architopia Foundation and a member of our board of directors. And Dr. BUICK was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. She specializes in art of the United States, focusing her research on African American art, the impact of race and gender on the history of art, representations of the American landscape, the visual and material cultures of the first British Empire, and the history of women as patrons and collectors of the arts. She has advanced scholarship of the work of numerous African American artists through publications. Buick is tenured full professor at the University of New Mexico, where she has taught since 2001. She earned her bachelor's degree in art history and Italian literature in 1985 from the University of Chicago. She earned her master and doctorate degrees in art history from the University of Michigan. Her book, Child of the Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis, and the Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject was published by Duke University Press. And her second book, In Authenticity, Kara Walker and the Eidetics of Racism, is in progress. Her published articles include studies on the work of artists including Daniel Coburn, Patrick Nagatani, Joseph Delaney, Aaron Douglas, Horace Pippin, and Kehinde Wiley. Buick has earned numerous academic, professional, and scholarly awards and grants, including the Driscoll Prize, Smithsonian American Art Museum's Predoctoral Fellowship, the Charles Gaius Bolin Fellowship at Williams College, CAA Professional Development Fellowship in Art History, Rhodes Foundation Visiting Lectureship, and the UNM University Libraries Faculty Acknowledgement Award. So thank you so much for being with us today.
So I am honored to participate in this event and honored to present as a keynote speaker with two scholars whose work I have long admired, Dipesh Chakravarty and Sharon Holland. I would also like to thank Architopia, specifically Francisco Guevara and Nayeli Hernandez. When I was asked to speak, I had long been thinking about how, in the words of Laurie Marish, in her book Sentimental Materialism, consumption constitutes a socio-political structure through which women were gendered feminine and were defined as free civil subjects. Her work has helped me to think critically about consumerism, and especially the consumerism around place, and how in particular, mobility and consumption of place conveys upon the mobile subject the fantasy of freedom, and how this mobility instantiates on those places visited the idea that these foreign spaces are made up of cultures of consent. These are two portraits by the Italian artist Pompeo Bottoni from the 18th century, and they are typical of grand tour portraits where the young gentlemen at the end of their education, and in some cases the assumption of their titles, take a trip to Italy. Here you have two Englishmen who lean authoritatively on the cultures of consent, in this case, Italian culture. Whereas Marish describes feminine consent as a new category of feminine agency, derived from pietistic Protestantism and defined as voluntary emotional orientation and affiliation, I want to widen the scope to consider travel and temporary relocation for aesthetic purposes, that an entire culture in the fantasy of the traveler can somehow consent to its own study, exploitation, appropriation, and cultural extraction. Culture as muse, culture as legible and portable, and even though foreign, both intimate and familiar. And this is how a lot of the heritage, the material culture, cultural heritage of Italy left. This is how the Elgin marbles left Greece, through these touristic aesthetic experiences. And in the portrait on the left, you see he holds a map of Rome. It is Rome made legible and coherent and reiterated by the Rome in the background, the Castel Sant'Angelo and St. Peter's. Even though the plinth on which he leans is not real, it does represent those sculptures, those ancient Roman sculptures that migrated and were stolen and purchased out of Italy and into Great Britain. And so this touch becomes significant in these portraits. It is a touch of ownership. It is the touch of understanding. It is the intimacy of the aesthetic experience. So with that, I'd like to dive into the meat of my talk today, the idea of cultures of consent, grand tourism, landscape, and the articulation and commodification of place. So how does the study of landscape representation sharpen our understanding of place? And I thought that Paco's talk, his opening remarks were especially evocative. And here I'd reiterate his use of Michel de Certeau's, how de Certeau distinguishes place from space. So he distinguishes place as the mapped, ordered representation from space, the illegible, heterogeneous, contextually protean use of time and location. Space lives. Place is dead. Space is actualized. Place is described. And the idea of dead place is reinforced in these kinds of grand tour portraits. And it reasserts something that the Italian author Alberto Moravia wrote about the Sahara Desert. In 1907, he published in the Corriere della Sera, which is the newspaper for Milan. He observed that in reality, one does not travel, or at least I do not travel in space, but in time, or if you prefer, in history. If we have time, we can speak at the end of my talk about the irony of Moravia's revelation around his travels in the Sahara. While for centuries, Europeans and Americans had and have similar fantasies of Italy, that they go to Florence to see the Renaissance, or that they go to Rome to experience the tyranny of the Colosseum and the emperors of Rome. That somehow the contemporary Italian existence is inconvenient to their experience of place. And so I thought I would share with you a little bit my work on American landscapes. This is the starting slide of my survey of American landscape representation. And I've had cause to think a lot about landscape representation over the last decade and a half, especially as a resident of the Southwest, where First Nations people are omnipresent, and because I serve in a department that receives significant funding to support land arts of the American West. It's a field-based art and ecology program that sponsors students and faculty on their aesthetic travels to sites throughout New Mexico, very often to Pueblos or the Dene and Apache nations. It has been my responsibility to either prepare students for the adventure, and I use the term adventure mindfully, or to debrief them upon their return, to ensure that they are not romanticizing ongoing constructions of the frontier. I want to ensure that students are not deploying the imperialist concepts of landscape, which expressly rely upon aestheticized experiences of place, or that they are not venturing out with a mission to save the planet while disregarding its inhabitants. And so I present two propositions: that landscape both renders invisible its own conventions and renders invisibility itself, whether through the conventions of the picturesque or map making, topographical and aerial views, or through the traditional choreographic registers of foreground, middle distance, and background. When I was being trained in art history in the early 80s, we were still using lantern slides. And they were crafty inventions in that the photography of these historic sites allowed for the removal of people. And so we rarely saw automobiles or Italians when we were looking at the Duomo in Florence. And so this idea of landscape renders invisible its own conventions, but also rendering invisibility itself is certainly operational in the study of place through the vehicle of art history. So here's my course description. The class provides an examination of how densely populated American environments were reinterpreted by Europeans upon contact in the process of designing and implementing various systems for their habitation, exploitation, and consumption. As Stephen Daniels and Dennis Cosgrove wrote in the introduction to the iconography of landscape, a landscape is a cultural image, a pictorial way of representing, structuring, or symbolizing surroundings. This is not to say that landscapes are immaterial. They may be represented in a variety of materials and on many surfaces, in paint on canvas, in writing on paper, in earth, stone, water, and vegetation on the ground. A landscape park is more palpable, but no more real, nor less imaginary than a landscape painting or poem. Indeed, the meanings of verbal, visual, and built landscapes have a complex interwoven history. And I'd ask you to stop there and think about artist residencies in similar fashion. American Landscapes, Artist Residencies, therefore, considers the myriad ways in which the land is articulated, from the more obvious landscape paintings to written representations in the form of essays, judicial documents, music, and sermons, to the manipulation of the earth itself, from disaster tourism to the grand monuments, both natural and man-made, that are narrated in a variety of forms to ground the new inhabitants as the so-called real Americans. We should also be mindful that the things we do, painting, writing, film, photography, maps, music, earthworks, to make sense of the landscape, also work to actively construct it. And again, think about the function of the artist's residency program. Furthermore, vision itself is not passive. It too is a highly mediated act of appropriation, disciplined by the various subject positions that even one person can assemble. While the course is roughly chronological, we will use 3 conceptual units within which the chronologies unfold to keep landscape active in our minds. That said, the conceptual units are landscape as verb, landscape as material culture, and landscape as process, performance, transformation. The purpose of this course is to familiarize students with the concepts that underpin both landscape representation in its various forms and the study of landscape itself, an alternate form of representation. How, in studying its representations, do we resist recolonizing it? Is that the proper question? Since the Enlightenment, the purpose of landscape painting and the purpose of artist residencies has been to prepare colonizers to settle the land and tourists to aestheticize it, and thereby acting as what Kant would deem moral agents, own it as well, if only temporarily. So landscape emerged out of religious painting, which itself used landscape representation to give the aura of reality to the biblical event. And here we have to keep in mind that realism is an ideology. And through convincing uses of perspective and chiaroscuro atmospheric effects, makes the Virgin coeval, that is, existing in the same time and space as Chancellor Roland. But it also takes the biblical event and relocates it to the Netherlands, thus providing a gloss of familiarity of place to its audience. By 1640, landscape emerged as its own genre, as its own subject. And here you see Poussin has merged landscape and history painting, and it subsumes the biblical event. St. John writes the book of Revelations, set among representations of civilizations that have ended. And here again, landscape as place, landscape as a dead thing, space as dead. This brings me rather mysteriously to Robert Smithson's chalk mirror displacement of 1969. Museums have fashioned themselves as churches, kind of secular churches, and their values, their religion, emphasizes authorship, authenticity, and permanence. Smithson's values would seem to fly in the face of the museum's religion. In 1969, he went to England. He went to a specific quarry in England, and he put in place 8 mirrors and arranged chalk around those mirrors. And the mirrors, because they reflect the chalk, look transparent. They look like glass. And so for Smithson, this was the site. This was the original. The non-site was the gallery or the museum. After Smithson's death, the Art Institute of Chicago was one of the spaces that licensed this concept, which was, over time, the museum, the gallery, representing the non-site, struggles with the impermanence of chalk, with the breakability of the mirrors. Mirrors not authored, chalk not authored by Smithson himself, but conceptually arranged to bear Smithson's trademark or copyright. And so Smithson, in arranging or in licensing this idea of chalk in a space, and chalk disperses over time, challenges the museum's religion of permanence. He challenges the museum's religion of authenticity and authorship. But he's not quite the bad boy he is proclaimed to be. The museum, over time, goes through absolute contortions to recreate this landscape. And so whatever curator of contemporary art is around at the time must fly to England to the specific quarry where Smithson mined the chalk, retrieve the chalk, replace the mirrors as they're broken over time, and thus renew the work and attach Smithson's name to the work. But it's nice work if you can get it, because you get a first-class trip to London. And this takes us to, of all things, Ark Encounter in Williamstown, Grant County, Kentucky. And this was the plan as of 2011. And I'd connect you back to the Jan van Eyck painting of Chancellor Roland, and actually even to the Smithson landscape representation. Because here, the original function of European landscape representation is made literal. An entire space carved out in Kentucky to give the aura of reality to the biblical event. Religion, like realism, is ideology. In 2011, the Kentucky Tourism Development Finance Authority gave a $43 million tax break in approval of this theme park / domestic tourist site. They commodified the various biblical sites. They carved out space, as you see, the journey through biblical history, the first century village, the Tower of Babel, the aviary, the children's area, the walled city, Noah's animals, and according to them, life-size recreation of Noah's Ark. And again, I'd remind you of Alberto Moravia's words that people do not travel in space, they travel in time. For various sums of money the public could invest, you could buy an actual plank of the Ark, and it was to be fully recreated with dinosaurs and humans. I use this theme park to demonstrate to students the urgency of the visual, the persuasive power of the visual, so that despite all historical and scientific evidence, such representations cement in the minds of those who attend that the earth is only 6,000 years old and that humans could breathe the same air as dinosaurs. Not to be outdone, Florida, in addition to Disneyland, has given us the Holy Land experience. And this is how they advertise it. The Holy Land experience offers an unforgettable adventure that immerses you in the sights, sounds, historical time frames, and impacting truths of the Bible. With its colorful and realistic, realism is an ideology, right? Recreations of ancient Israel, unforgettable interactive exhibits, awe-inspiring theatrical productions, and special hands-on fun for kids of all ages. The Holy Land experience brings the word of the Bible to life. As a Christian-based theme park, our goal is for you to see God's word exalted, so you will be encouraged. And then they say it's educational, it's inspirational, it's theatrical, it's historical. And so there's something about the Bible itself that is inadequate, that these theme parks, in times where the perception is that faith is being challenged successfully, these theme parks rise up, and they provide the tactile, sensorial buttressing of the biblical word. And it's no accident that these parks appear in politically red states, places like Florida and Kentucky, and that they appropriate the Holy Land as place and relocate it to the United States. And so these parks are also statements about nationalism and about nation and the superiority of nation. The idea that that excuse me, that America is a process more so than a space or a place, that we are a perfected Holy Land. And so these parks emphasize this idea of the exceptionalism of America. So one of the things I emphasize to students is that we can use landscape representation to think through place. That landscape representation is a medium of communication, and that we can use it to kind of understand how we are positioned individually and in the assigned groups or perceived groups to which we belong. And I'd remind you again of Michel de Certeau's words, that place is mapped, ordered representation, that place is dead. That space, on the other hand, is the illegible, heterogeneous, contextually protean use of time and location. That space is alive. That space is actualized, while place is described. And I'd also add the work of the scholar Eric Purchas, who in 1999 published his book Out of Nowhere, Disaster and Tourism in the White Mountains. And Purchas defines nowhere as that space that is yet to be made financially beneficial. It is yet to be commodified. And so it is no surprise that U.S. domestic tourism was sparked by the death of a family and the destruction of property. In 1823, in the White Mountains, the Wiley family was wiped out by a mudslide. The house was preserved, but the entire family and their employees, their laborers, were killed. And an enterprising man decided to open the first domestic tourist site, museum. He had someone come in and rebake the bread and dust off the interior of the home. And he cut roads and built hotels. And Americans paid to see this place that nature had decided to preserve the landscape, but destroy the family. And so, as I said, it's no surprise that U.S. domestic tourism was sparked by the death of a family and the destruction of property. That the White Mountains were transformed from a space or from nowhere, in the words of Eric Purchas, into a place, into a tourist destination. A segment of my landscapes class is entirely devoted to what Naomi Klein terms disaster capitalism. So we look at the 1823 tragedy and the rise of domestic tourism. From there, we moved to the 1827 flood of the Mississippi River to Hurricane Katrina. And how out of these disasters, capital is extracted. And what do we learn? We learn that we can afford to lose a city. We can afford to lose lives as long as capital is assured. And so, aestheticizing the land, mining its symbolic function, was supposedly an objectifying ability granted to those who were white and male. Our first and most celebrated landscape artists were white men, because it was thought that whether European or from the United States or identifying as white in Central and Latin America, you were not only entitled to own that land, you could also own it through the aesthetic experience. And part of aestheticizing that space, part of turning and transforming that space into place, you were taught the simple process of dividing space into foreground, middle distance, and background. Parsing the land into landscape, which meant that the foreign was also familiar, and that tourism was and is conquest writ small. And I turn your attention to Ken Burns's 2009 documentary, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. And I only have to show the first 15 minutes to my class, and they get it. They get that this documentary is actually part of a long history of US landscape representation and conquest writ small. As Burns rhapsodizes about the democratizing experience and process of the national parks. And so as the documentary opens, we see primordial ooze, we hear native drumming and chanting, but then the first legible voice is an actor in the guise of John Muir, the Scottish explorer, who comes to North America and it becomes enchanted by the landscape. And so the first articulate words, the first articulation of the landscape is by a white European male. The third scene that Burns sets after the primordial ooze, the location and the locating of prehistory with the native chanting and drumming and primordial ooze, the introduction of history in the form of the white male European voice with the Scottish accent. The third event in this documentary, within the first 15 minutes, the third event opens in Yosemite Valley. And it opens on the scene of a massacre. White men have come and they are slaughtering a peaceful village made up of Native Americans. And one of the white men, and here, this is from his journal, he looks up and away from the scene of slaughter and notices the beauty of the landscape. Now, Burns does nothing with the linkages of the aestheticizing experience and racial violence. But for my students, this is a revelatory moment, right? It's that moment when they understand that the act of aestheticization is not separate or apart from acts of violence. And I always threaten to return them to the documentary if they misbehave. But I want to say that tourism, nationalism, and landscape representation, and now artist residencies, right, are all part of the grand tour. And they're all part of hierarchies. Here's another landscape representation I return to, and it actually reinforces the idea that landscape is a genre that is hierarchical, that it excludes women from certain forms of representation, even as it implicates women in the domestic. This is Frances Palmer, a lithograph across the continent, westward the course of empire takes its way. And I emphasize that it is a lithograph because Frances Palmer is or was a woman. And the representation of landscape, the most that white women were allowed were in the form of lithographs or in studies of plants and flowers. It's why Georgia O'Keeffe, once she is discouraged from landscape by her husband and art dealer, Alfred Stieglitz, why she turns to flowers and plants. Because she, in her curmudgeonly way, reasons, if that's all you're going to allow me, I'm going to make them big, I'm going to make them vaginal, and I'm going to put them in your face. But here, Frances Palmer, for the publishing house Currier and Ives, creates this lithograph in which Native Americans are literally or figuratively, erased by the smoke of a superior white technology that brings not tourists, but colonizers, settlers from New York into the West. And busily and active on the lower left side is the construction of white civilization, the supplanting of history, the erasure of prehistory. And there's O'Keeffe herself in the New Mexico landscape, who made a place for herself, who extracted herself from Stieglitz's grip, Stieglitz, who'd photographed her over 800 times, who suggested what she could paint, when she could paint, found a measure of freedom in New Mexico by de-sexing herself, becoming the crone of the desert. And so here, landscape performs its transformative function. And there's a reason, right, that O'Keeffe is the first well-known, famous woman who painted landscape. It took just that long. It took until 1929 for a woman to gain credibility as an artist of landscape representation. And so what are the functions of landscape representation? Landscape representation normalizes the relational, performative, and participatory aspects of power according to gender, class, race, and sexual orientation. Reread that with an eye towards the function of artist residencies, right? They normalize the relational, performative, and participatory aspects of power according to gender, class, race, and sexual orientation. And think of the debates taking place at all levels of culture over bathrooms. Bathrooms which have become a proxy for the debate over whether trans people can exist in public spaces at all. Landscape representation spatializes power. Artist residencies spatialize power. They map power relations onto geography, which is a point I think Paco made so beautifully in his opening remarks when he gave us that very timely history of artist residencies and showed us that map of where they're located, where they're centered. Landscape representation, artist residencies, empower space to function as the proxy for power. Landscape representation racializes space and it spatializes race. It engenders space and it spatializes gender. And if we change that, and I'm thinking, and I pulled this idea of the racialization of space from George Lipsitz's work on how racism takes place. But if we reconceptualize it in the words of Michel de Certeau, landscape representation engenders place. It engenders place. Just as artist residencies do. So artist residencies are actually a form of landscape representation. And here's how in the American South during the era of Jim Crow, how landscape was articulated. In this case, through signs. No dogs, Negroes, Mexicans. That sign was localized to Texas, but in the American Southeast, restrooms, those designated for whites, those designated for Black people. And how space within interiors were also segregated, how it was articulated racially. And here colored seated in rear. And so what is landscape? Think of it as a verb rather than a noun. Landscape is a process rather than a thing. It is a resource and a symbol. It is a medium. Paint, stone, fabric, garden, artist residency. It is a system of delivery. It is a medium also in that it is a system of delivery, of communication. Landscape is a communicating event. The artist residency is a communicating event. It doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations. Landscape is an instrument of power, and perhaps even an agent of power that represents itself as independent of human intentions. It's why landscapes look so boring. Landscape naturalizes a cultural and social construction, representing an artificial world as if it were simply given and inevitable. This is Thomas Cole's painting from 1830 of Niagara Falls, and perfectly encapsulates this idea of landscape as a process, landscape as a verb. He made this very small painting for a project that was to be called Picturesque America. It was to include engravings by artists as well as writings on landscape. And it never reached fruition, but we do have this painting. And by 1830, Niagara Falls was already a tourist destination. 1825, the Erie Canal is cut in New York State, and New York becomes the financial capital of the United States, and thus an important destination because of places like Niagara Falls, an important tourist destination. And so here you have the Grand Tour made middle class, the day trip. Trains allowed middle-class travelers to take trips, day trips. They couldn't spend the months and the years that a Grand Tour trip entailed, but they could go on these short jaunts. By 1830, Niagara Falls was filled with Native Americans who made and sold souvenirs. It was filled with viewing platforms. It was filled with hotels and traffic. And so what Cole gives us is this rather halcyon view of Niagara Falls. No viewing platforms, no hotels, no bustling tourist traffic, no Native Americans selling souvenirs. Instead, you have autumn as the season, which is deliberate. You have the foreground, the middle distance, which includes the Horseshoe Falls themselves, and the background. And I always ask my students, identify the light source. And there are two. There's the light that shines outside of the painting into the foliage, and then there's the metaphoric, symbolic, divine light that comes out of the clouds. Cole has chosen the season of autumn because it too is the metaphor for the two Native Americans standing on the precipice, no villages surrounding them. They are contemplating their end on this continent. And so autumn becomes the metaphor for their time in this place. But there is no place for them in New York State. But here's what one of the 19th century viewing platforms looked like. All of this he painted out. You can see hotels in the background. You can see viewing towers as well. It became a honeymoon spot for white Americans. Their bridal tour, this is from Harper's Weekly, 1868. It's by Winslow Homer. Their bridal tour at Niagara Falls. And so the cliche of Niagara Falls was established in the 19th century. It was also thought that the waters had medicinal properties, that it was a kind of liquid Viagra that stimulated husbands so that they could do their duty and breed another generation. Here's a typical tourist photo of a family at Niagara Falls. Here is a commemorative plate that you could take home with you. You could take the falls home with you. But here's one of the most important souvenirs from Niagara Falls. This is a birch bark and moose hair glove box made by the Huron-Wendat people, someone from the Huron-Wendat nation. And it was collected by Johann Schwartz, and it currently finds its home in the Museum of Folk Art in Vienna. And it was collected around 1853. And Ruth B. Phillips, in her book Trading Identities, the Souvenir and Native North American Art from the Northeast, 1700 to 1900, makes this point. And so you have materials that are used by Indigenous people, repurposed for material cultures representative of white civility, gloves. Right? But Phillips makes this point. She says the absorption of souvenir wares into the clothing and domestic spaces of non-Aboriginal people offered a means of capturing Indianness and rendering it consumable. And so this idea of a consumable culture, this idea of race as consumable, is significant. The other point that Phillips makes is important. During this era of what Carl Jacobi describes as an era of extermination, the souvenir and the accompanying demand for Indian performativity around the making and selling of their identities also allowed for means of cultural retention. And so the things that would normally be disallowed because it reinforced cultural Indianness. Because it had been commodified, was now allowed. And so, for example, Native Americans around the Niagara area were allowed to retain their traditional dances and dress for the entertainment of tourists, but also in the interests of cultural retention. And here's a stereograph card of Tuscarora squaws, as it's called, on Luna Island in Niagara Falls, selling their wares. And here you have two white women shown picking over the objects of their labor as they trade identities. And this goes back to Laurie Marish's book on consumption. Consumption as a quality that engenders femininity. In this case, consumption or taste is a quality of racialization as well. Who sells, who buys, the status of the indigenous women as lower than the white women who stand over them and who give them money in exchange for their identities as the original inhabitants of the United States. And so landscape, the artist residency, right? They function as arenas of symbolic action, a quasi-utopian endeavor that helps to order culturally a space inherently open-ended and unstable. Landscape is an instrument, perhaps even an agent, of power that frequently represents itself as independent of human intentions. The various media used to represent landscape are always already secondary representations. Because, as we tend to forget, the subject matter is not simply raw material, but is always already a symbolic form in its own right. Landscape is not an object to be seen or a text to be read, but a process by which social and subjective identities are formed. And I'll reread that, replacing landscape with artist residency, right? An artist residency is not an object to be seen or a text to be read. An artist residency is a process by which social and subjective identities are formed. Landscape is a function of ideology, whether racial or gendered or classed, or in the words of Del Upton, landscape is an extension of ideological processes. Nature is a construct, more productively conceptualized as the culture of nature. Landscape is a communicating event that results from and results in culture. And this is an idea taken from Henry Blassie, who wrote a very important book titled Material Culture. But think about it in terms of artist residencies. Artist residencies are communicating events that result from and result in culture. While culture is an arrangement of ideas, a cognitive structure of generative principles, whirring and grinding intention. Culture is space. Landscape is place. The artist's residency is place. And ultimately, landscape is a verb. And so cultures of consent and fantasies of conquest in artist residency. I took Paco's first question around why landscape, or why the Grand Tour. Before artists arrive, and these are just my kind of concluding remarks. Before artists arrive, they already have fantasies of place. Such fantasies are embedded in the process of selection. The inconveniences of daily life in the residency are born of the present, they are born of space, conflicting with the desire for the past or for fantasies of elsewhere. That is, desires of place or desires for the exotic. The commodification of space transforms it into place, while the money that the artist spends signifies their taste and entitles them to appropriate the identities of place, the past, the exotic, elsewhere. Such appropriations take the form of artworks, performances, relocation of the fantasy to the primary home audience, where it will be repackaged and itself commodified. Travel and temporary residence for the purpose of aesthetics, the classed and racialized aspects of mobility are part of an old fantasy of conquest. It embodies the appreciation of landscape, not only as resource, but also as symbol. And this appreciation includes the local inhabitants, a stationary, and part of the picturesque scenery. It is a soft fantasy of conquest, symbolic, spiritual, and sentimental. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I wonder if when you were presenting these different forms of place, how place is invented, you can also click on the stop presenting, and that way the screen will
We
go
can
back.
see.
There you go. Yes. Thank you. When you were showing these images of how we are placed in relation to power, for instance, the bathrooms, the seating places, it made me think of the European Union. And recently we were having these conversations with Karim Katan. He's a scholar from Palestine. And we were talking about how this symposium is very different from others because these relationships are usually mediated by place. So for instance, how Palestine and Mexico would find each other would have to be in London or in Germany or in a place that it's mediated, just as we showed in the previous maps of residencies. It's rare to find these connections between Tanzania and Mexico and Palestine and Kyrgyzstan. These geographies, which is also an extension of landscape, but these space where we can reconnect without having to be mediated. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how place can function in that regard.
That is a question around technology
Mm-hmm.
that has always intrigued me. In early film, technology was fantasized as the savior. It was fantasized as the space where truth could be revealed, where vice could be overthrown. And so in early films made in the United States, for example, Traffic in Souls from 1913 by George Lone Tucker, or White Heat, which is the gangster film with James Cagney, technology becomes a device that exposes truth. It's the device that saves the virtue of the young woman. It's the device that dethrones a criminal enterprise. And so because of those early fantasies around technology, I'm always suspicious, right? Even though we can now, even though we don't now have to go through Europe, we're still going through the technologies of corporations. They can spy on us. They can shut us off and shut us down. they can give primacy to right-wing voices. And so we do what we can with what we have. And so, the digital world is also, unfortunately, a place.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I was also wondering, when we think about residencies, because we at Architopia we've started to think about space and time in opposition to history and place. In the recent years, we even talk about it explicitly, and I always say the residency is the moment where we encounter and sit down to negotiate the process of ideas and the process of production. The place itself is not the residency. We don't care about the whole structure. It's needed because it's infrastructure, but it's not um, real in any sense. What the residency is actually this encounter. So I wonder, how could we challenge uh, this invention of place as residencies? Because a lot of the residencies, or actually most of or all of the residencies who were invited to the symposium, struggle. We struggle to survive. And not because of artists, but because of how you're explaining it. Corporations make it difficult. It make it difficult for people to travel to Mexico today because it's imagined and fantasized as dangerous. So although it's attractive, it's also dangerous, or it is actually attractive because it's dangerous. So what could we do as residencies to rethink place?
I think Architopia is already doing it, but the problem is we are trapped in structures that are old. And when you talked about how Mexico can be attractive because it's both exotic, but also dangerous. This reminds me of Edmund Burke's formulation of the sublime, where they've commodified danger. They've made danger both it's both safe and apart. It's why people went to Naples to see Mount. You could keep danger near and yet safe, and pleasurable terror are the two words that describe this sublime. It's why the people who can't afford to take helicopter rides around Hawaii will ride on a roller coaster. So the idea of Mexico as elsewhere, as the exotic, as place, I think Architopia is successfully challenging. Not that you wanted this answer to be an advertisement.
No, not at all, but it's useful to rethink of it.
But it's a useful advertisement.
I was also thinking about the very precise way of describing museums, how they rely on authorship, authenticity, and permanence, and how, as they are struggling to maintain that possibility, residencies have become more important. So we've seen a wave of residents who are required to have a residency in the resume to become, for instance, professors, or to be hired in new positions, or to maintain their positions. So what could we expect in terms of authenticity, authorship, and permanence in terms of residencies?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paco. Again, we're working in structures that are old. People can now afford to travel to the human zoo. The human zoo doesn't have to come to you on the back of a World's Fair. So all the world's a zoo. Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage. Timothy in Colonizing Egypt says, all the world's an exhibition. I say, all the world's a zoo. All the world's a zoo. And so you're absolutely right. This is a critical point for museums. There was a huge amount of hysteria because one of the major museums that's forced to close because of the pandemic here in the United States was considering selling one of its pieces. And so once you start dispersing of the collection, not to acquire something else that you value more, but to survive, right? The survivability of museums have now been called into question. So you're right. The onus is now on the artist residency to continue the religion of the museum. And they do that because, again, people travel in time. They don't travel in space. And so they go to Mexico to see and experience certain aspects of the exotic or the past or history. They go to Sicily or Florence or Rome for similar reasons. And so the onus is on the artist residency because the museum is endangered.
Yes, and I think this is a good reminder of our future. You know, when we think about future plays and state, the state of residencies, we really need to think about these 3 points: authorship, authenticity, and permanence as 3 big questions that we need to challenge so that we don't fall into the traps of the system over and over again.
Yeah, you don't want to reinforce authenticity. No.
Or permanence even.
Or permanent. The permanence of the past.
Right.
Right. And who gets to preserve that past? When I was a kid growing up, my sister and I, we were enchanted by the Greek actress, Elena Mercouri. And every year she'd go to the British Museum and bring the press, and she would cry over the Elgin marbles. She'd lean on them, she'd touch them, she'd sob. Why don't they home? And so you have these cultures like Great Britain that pride themselves on preservation. That the homes of the original homes of these objects cannot be cared for. These people, these places have forfeited their culture because they are inadequate caretakers. And so authorship, in that case, it moves. It moves to a caretaker culture.
Yes, and that also relates to what you were explaining with culture as space. Once they're out of that space, they become monuments.
Yes.
In a similar way as relics function, for instance, in Latin America. We don't necessarily care too much about monuments because that's an invention more recent, but relics.
And of Protestantism.
Right. Right. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and it expands many of the questions that we have about residencies. I think the possibility of the future is really interesting for residencies who will understand these questions. And we are also looking forward to rethink the way we relate to each other. Why do we have to be mediated? So if it's not necessarily, or if we can actually challenge that, then what does the future look like for us? So thank you again for your generosity and for taking the time. This is very valuable for us, so we want to thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
We miss you.
We miss you too. We miss you too, Dr. Buick.
But we will see you soon. We will see you soon.